the significance of Yutas Kislev, of what its relevance is to this class, because I think as we approach this Hasidic holiday, the Rosh Hashanah, the new year of the Hasidic movement, it's important for us to have an understanding what it's about, and therefore we're going to address the Hasidic Renaissance today. And I think it's worthwhile for us to talk a little bit about the history of Hasidic movement. While I've got some interesting videos, and we'll watch one of them today, please God, there are some others that I will hopefully share tomorrow that will shed light in a much better way and with more graphic images than I could do. We want to keep this obviously interactive and multimedia. It keeps all our senses and everything involved. And I have a lot of texts that I'm going to, please God, be adding in as well that are relevant to our discussion. Let's go back a little bit into history. We all know that when did the Hasidic movement begin? Anyone familiar with it? In the aftermath of the devastation that was brought about by the Khmelnytsky pogroms. If you looked at this morning's WhatsApp message where I gave a little introduction, that was called the year Tach V'Tat. What's Tach? Taf Ches. That is an acronym for the year 1648. Tat is 1649. It was a terrible pogrom in which 300,000 Jews were massacred in Eastern Europe. It was a devastating, you can imagine what that brought about. And there were many other incidents at the time. In the aftermath of that, it brought poverty, it brought anguish, there were many orphans and widows, and it was a very difficult time for the Jewish people. And also, there was another challenge at the time, which was the false Messiah, Shabtai Tzvi. Any of you familiar with him? All of that brought the morale of the Jewish people to a very low state, lower than the lowest it's been probably since maybe the Spanish Inquisition or Spanish Jewry. It was a very sad time on our calendar. In the background of that, in the year 1734, a man who was 36 years old at the time, Rabbi Israel Baal Shem Tov, in fact, it was his 36th birthday. He was born on the 18th of Kislev in 1698. He decided to revolutionize the Jewish world at the time with a whole new approach. And his approach as starting the Hasidic movement was one that was going to be a different Jewish way of life, one that would be more joyous, one in which all Jews can participate, not just the scholarly elites, but even the simple peasant kind of Jews, the farmers, the simple people. Everyone can play an active role in Judaism. And that was the start of the Hasidic movement. I'm going to fast forward a little bit from the time that the Rabbi Yisrael Baal Shem Tov initiated this movement that literally breathed a new life and light into the hearts of the Jewish masses. And we're going to move forward into the time of the Alter Rebbe, the founder of Chabad. During that period, okay, we're talking about from 1734, the Alter Rebbe was born in the year 1745, not long after. Okay, there was tremendous opposition to the Hasidic movement. The Hasidic movement was not just a way of life, there was a philosophy behind it. And we want to talk a little bit about that philosophy. And that's where we'll answer Tzipporah's question about the imminence. What is imminence? But maybe we'll do that tomorrow or next week as we get more into the philosophy. So while I think we've previously covered, particularly on Chai Elul, on the birthday of the Alter Rebbe and the Baal Shem Tov, we talked a little bit about what the Hasidic movement was. I want to get a little deeper into it today and talk about what was the philosophical difference. Where was this divergence that there was such opposition to it? And that opposition is something we're going to demonstrate today. We're going to look at why it was and what it was, and hopefully that will give us a greater appreciation of the Hasidic movement and maybe a better understanding of its opponents, not in a brutal way, not in a just superficial and antagonistic hatred, but maybe to understand it from a much deeper way. And that's really the perspective I want to take. Because the teachings of Hasidus were obviously, we learn Hasidus today. In fact, I think everything today is seen from the prism, from the perspective of Hasidus, from the Hasidic paradigm. But it wasn't always that case. And there was a time when it was derided with tremendous suspicion by other Jews, and that led to some very bitter controversies. So we're going to examine the teachings of the Alter Rebbe, who shared with us the Chabad Hasidic approach. And we're going to look at it and see and explore how he understood the causes and nature of this controversy and how he guided his followers. And we'll start off with that, in fact, through this difficult time. And in fact, if I look at it in this perspective, it's sad if we look at the last 12 months of the past year, we saw a lot of division and conflict in the Jewish community, particularly in Israel. And what's so sad about it is that it took October 7th to bring us together. We don't need, we can live and let live. We could agree to disagree. We could have different perspectives and different opinions. But it shouldn't, God forbid, lead to animosity, to hatred that we've seen. We're going to look at some of that, of what happened 250 years ago when the Chabad movement began. And I'm proud to say that my great-grandparents were there from the very beginning. And to share with you some of that, what happened. Pardon? No. Just pay attention. You'll hear we're not talking about Yom Kippur War. We're talking about a story that happened 250 years ago. Okay. Yeah. I'll put all the things on the screen. And once again, I want to remind everybody, please don't interrupt. Your questions will be answered from time to time. But it's sad that I keep saying this over and over. Please forgive me. But it makes it very, very difficult for those watching online when we have constant interruption. So I'll answer all of your questions. If you're afraid you'll forget it, just jot down some note in front of you and we'll remind you what your question is and I'll be happy to answer it, okay? But not to keep interjecting, please. Thank you. We do want this to be interactive, which is why I will take breaks every couple of minutes. In fact, since we're at it, I'm happy to take a quick break, only relevant to this particular topic of anything I mentioned until now. Anything? 50 years ago was the Yom Kippur War, but we addressed that in last class. Okay. You could go back. There's videos of it on YouTube. We recorded it. Also, okay, there we go. So we have quite a few recordings about that class. And if anyone wants, we could address it separately, but that's recorded on video. Okay. If you're watching us on YouTube and you want to know where the Yom Kippur War class is, just go back to one of the past videos. I don't know which direction, somewhere here on YouTube, and you'll find it. Okay. Let's talk now. Pardon? Question. He was the founder of Chabad. He was the first Rebbe in the Chabad dynasty. Before him, the Alter Rebbe was preceded by the Maggid of Mezrich and the Baal Shem Tov. And you reminded me of a particular Hayom Yom. I think it was 2 days ago that we read this Hayom Yom, or maybe it was last week, Thursday. Okay, the 3rd of Kislev. So I will give you that Hayom Yom now to answer your question. The Hasidic movement was started by the Baal Shem Tov. Okay, he's the person I was just talking about, Rabbi Israel Baal Shem Tov. You'll see a little bit more about him on the video that I'll show you just now. Okay. The Baal Shem Tov founded the Hasidic movement again in 1734. Now, the Baal Shem Tov was a very outgoing person. Kind of like we're reading the Torah portions of the current time of year, Avraham Avinu, founder of the Jewish nation. He was a very outgoing person. He was born in Mesopotamia. Anyone remember what year the Avraham Avinu was born? Abraham. 1948 from creation. Okay, easy to remember. The founding of the state of Israel and Avraham Avinu, same year. Obviously, 1948 is on the current era, and 1948 is from creation. Okay, two different calendars. The Jewish calendar versus the Gregorian or common calendar that we count today. Now, something interesting as well. How old was Abraham when God instructed him and commanded him to leave his father's home, his parents' home, everything he knew in the environment, the culture that he was growing up in Mesopotamia? No, he was 75. He was 100, close. He was 100 when he became a father of Yitzchak. He had a child before that known as Ishmael. That was 13 years earlier. Also not too shabby. At 87 became a dad. Now, Abraham was 75 years old. How old is Israel today? 75. Very interesting corollary there, hey? Very interesting corollary that Israel is 75 years old and Abraham was 75 when Hashem gave him that mission, Lech Lecha, go. Abraham was a very outgoing person. Abraham traveled. He came to Israel. He went back to Egypt. He went here. He went there. He was the missionary of Judaism. He started the Jewish religion. He taught people about one God. That was the main principle that he taught the world, monotheism, belief in one almighty God, creator of heaven and earth. That was Avram's mission. The founder of the Hasidic movement, the Baal Shem Tov, did something very similar. He traveled. He traveled quite a bit. In fact, he even tried to get to Israel. It's quite a famous, interesting story about how, and I think I told the story before Pesach, so I'm not going to bore you with it now. But that's the story of Avraham Avinu. Who was Abraham's son and successor? Yitzchak. What was Yitzchak's surname? Abramson. So, Yitzchak Avinu, anyone know something about him? He did not travel. He lived all of his life in the sacred, holy soil of Israel. Never left. Interesting, when the Baal Shem Tov passed away in the year 1760, I believe it was, he had a successor who he had appointed. One of his disciples, known as the Maggid of Mezrich, his name was Rabbi Dov Ber. Rabbi Dov Ber, like Yitzchak Avinu, the successor of Avraham Avinu, did not travel. The successor of the Baal Shem Tov stayed in his place in the city of Mezrich. I don't know if that's Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, somewhere there in Eastern Europe. And he stayed put. He didn't go places. So you see a very interesting correlation. Of course, we, as the spiritual heirs of Avraham Avinu and Yitzchak Avinu, and each of us can take both of those approaches in our life. There's an aspect of us, we like to travel. I just came back from a journey traveling the whole world. I mean, mind you, I went from Joburg to Australia with a couple of stops in between in Bangkok, Singapore, and Hong Kong. And then I came back via Dubai. And here I am. Oh, wait. And New York, right? So I really traveled the length and breadth of the world. There's an aspect of us that likes to travel. And the truth is, each of us goes out every day and we travel. We go places. You come to Chabad house, you go to work, you go shopping. Wherever you are in the world, like the Baal Shem Tov, like Avraham Avinu, you have to be a beacon of light. You have to teach the world about goodness and kindness and Judaism's message of dispelling the darkness in the world. At the same time, there's the aspect of Yitzchak Avinu, who stayed put, like the Maggid of Mezrich. And each of us has our mission where we are at home, where we need to do our things where we are. There are those who go out to battle. There are those who are fighting in Gaza for us, and there are those on the home front. Each of us plays an important mission. So now, those were the founders of the Hasidic movement. Baal Shem Tov started it. His successor was the Maggid of Mezrich. The Maggid of Mezrich did something very different, maybe like Yaakov Avinu, the third of our patriarchs. And that was, Yaakov had 12 sons, right? The 12 tribes of Israel. The Maggid of Mezrich, who stayed put in his hometown, he had a different approach. He delegated to each of his disciples. He had many disciples. He said, you will all now be Rebbes. You'll each be spiritual luminaries. Like the Rebbe sent shluchim around the world. This week's Parsha. Ufaratzta yama v'kedma tzafana v'negba. Hashem's instruction to Yaakov, you will spread in every direction. That's what the Maggid did. He sent each of his disciples, and he said, you will each be beacons of light, leaders in your generation, in your locales. And that's where you had now different branches of the Hasidic movement sprouting all over Europe. Now, with that, we could go into the Alter Rebbe. Who was the Alter Rebbe? Sorry, I'm going to have to find a way to get myself a clicker or something that I can move my slides without having to turn around each time. Okay, so the Alter Rebbe, you can see a picture of him on the screen. Yes? Rabbi Shner Zalman of Liadi. He was a disciple of the Maggid of Mezrich and the Baal Shem Tov, and he founded the Hasidic movement. To answer your question, Raz, Alter means old, okay? He was the old Rebbe. It's pretty old in this picture, although he was born in 1745 and passed away in 1813. Didn't live necessarily that long of a life in modern terms, contemporary standards. But that's why is he called the Alter Rebbe? I think that reflects his position as the original founder, the first leader of the Chabad movement. Again, there's many Hasidic movements, and there's lots of branches. Maybe anyone want to, here's a chance for you to speak your voice. Tell me what other Hasidic movements you might be familiar with. Babava, very good. Breslov, very good. By the way, the founder of Breslov was Rabbi Nachman of Breslov. He was a grandson of the Baal Shem Tov, a biological grandchild, whereas the Alter Rebbe was more of a spiritual ear, of a spiritual grandchild. The Alter Rebbe referred to the Baal Shem Tov as a Zayden, his grandfather, but he wasn't a biological grandchild. He was a spiritual. Yep. Bells. My grandparents were Belzer Hasidim. Tzanz, yes, Tzanz is another Hasidic movement. That's right. Ladies and gents, I'm going to interrupt for a second to take this call. Just a second, ladies and gents. Tzuki. Yes. The Belzer Shul, in my opinion, is one of the nicest shuls. My family lives in Kiryat Belz because I guess, I don't know if I don't think I have any relatives who are Belzer Hasidim today, but my uncle, who's more of a following the Litvak, the Lithuanian yeshivish style, he lives in Kiryat Belz. And we joke about it because his father, my grandfather, my mother's father was a Belzer, came from the Belzer Hasidic movement. You know, you're familiar with bells? Bells, mein steht alle bells, mein Heisel, mein Land, wo ich hab meine kindische Joren verbracht. Ronnie, could you sing us bells? You know that song? Nish. Anyways, bells was a big Hasidic movement. Which do you think is actually one of the biggest Hasidic movements between Chabad? I would say today Chabad is probably one of the biggest, but maybe there's one more that might be as big or maybe a little bigger. Certainly used to be bigger. Maybe today with Chabad's influence and Chabad's followers around the world, Chabad is probably bigger. But which would you say is the next rivaling? Chabad and Lubavitch is the same. Good question you're mentioning there, Rosemary. Chabad is the name of the philosophy. We'll talk about that more tomorrow. It stands for Chachma, Bina, Dat. I'll put it on the screen, please, God, so you understand what it means. Wisdom, knowledge, understanding. The three words sound very similar, but it is a difference between them, and we'll focus more on that tomorrow. But Lubavitch is the town where Chabad was located for more than 100 years. Now, although probably today Crown Heights has had Chabad Hasidim also for over 100 years, but the previous Rebbe only settled in Crown Heights in 1940. In fact, he visited Crown Heights in 1929 as well, because there were Chabad Hasidim already living there. But Lubavitch is a town in Russia where I have great-grandparents who are buried, and that's a town where the Chabad movement was headquartered for over a century. In fact, the Baal Shem Tov himself also lived in Lubavitch at some point. So Lubavitch is a town, and therefore many of the Hasidic movements that you just mentioned, Belz, Satmar, Vizhnitz, Papa, Bobov, Alexander, you keep naming them, they're mostly related to towns where these Hasidic movements were based. Now, the Alter Rebbe did not live in Lubavitch. He lived in a city called Liadi. He passed away near Liozna, in a place called Piena. So those were cities where he lived. And that's why oftentimes the Alter Rebbe is called Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi. Or Liozna, which was another place he lived. He lived in a few places, and those are related to the movement. But his children, his sons, settled in the town of Lubavitch, and it stayed in Lubavitch all the way through to the previous Rebbe. Okay, over 100 years, over a century. And that's why Chabad is often called Lubavitch as well. But all these other Hasidic movements, everyone is related to a town, a particular city where they were situated. Okay. So that takes us now to the Alter Rebbe, founder of Chabad, and he was the first leader of the Chabad movement, but there were many other movements that started around the same time. They all had a particular philosophy or approach or a perspective on life. Pardon? Eli Wiesel, yes, he came from Vizhnitz. That's true. Okay, that's true. Now, the Alter Rebbe wrote a few works he wrote a few works, one of them being the Shulchan Aruch Harav, his version of the Shulchan Aruch, where he codified the Jewish laws based on, updating it for his time. There weren't changes in the laws, but incorporated laws that were not included in the first original written by the Mechaber, Rabbi Yosef Karo. What other books did he write? What was his most famous book? Let's focus on that. It's on the screen. Tanya, exactly. He did not call it Tanya, he called it Likutei Amarim, a compilation of teachings. Tanya is the first word of the book, and somehow that kicked off. But oftentimes people ask me, who's Tanya? Who is she? Listen, we got some wonderful Tanyas who walk through this Chabad house. But Tanya is the first word of the book, which means we learned, we studied. And he's quoting a Baraisa, a teaching, the Soif Perek Gimel Nida, in the end of the third chapter of Tractate Nida. We'll talk more about that next week, a little bit more about the philosophy, okay? And Tanya was first printed in 1796, okay? And it serves as a practical guide to the average Jew. In fact, the Alter Rebbe gave it a different name. He called it Likutei Amar Sefer Shel Beinanim, the book of the intermediate, the average Jew, because in the first chapter of Tanya, the Alter Rebbe quotes the Talmud, and the Talmud talks about 5 levels of individuals, of Jews, talks about the righteous and 2 levels of pious, and then it talks about the evil and the wicked and 2 levels of that. He says, I'm not going to talk to the wicked Jew, I'm not going to talk to the pious Jew. I'm talking to the average Jew. How to navigate our personal journey in a healthy spiritual alignment. If you look at this week's Parsha, again, Abayetze, Yaakov Avinu, our patriarch, has a dream. What does he see in his dream? La'avdol, what was it? Martin Luther King Jr., I have a dream. Okay, he talks about a dream, a world of peace. What does Yaakov Avinu see in his dream in our Parsha? A ladder. And what is on that ladder? Angels climbing up and down. Let me share with you a story. As I just came back from New York, from the Kinnas HaShluchim, I was in 770, and the 770 was a beacon of light since the previous Rebbe bought that building in 1940, and it served as the headquarters of the Chabad Lubavitch movement ever since. And many people were privileged to have meetings, to have a private audience with the Rebbe. Anyone here had a private meeting with the Rebbe? Rebbe Moshe, did you ever have a meeting with the Rebbe? Oh, yeah, Yechidus. Wow, I would love to hear about that. 1977? Wow. Okay, you got to tell us about it. Together. Okay, Fegi and Moshe, you'll have to tell us about your Yechidus. I would love to hear about it. Irrelevant. In 1977. The story I was going to tell you has happened in the 60s, when there were some students, some college students who were visiting New York. It was during their winter vacation. And while they were in New York, they were going to see the various attractions. And one of them had a relative who said, why don't you go visit the Rebbe? Okay? That's a very important attraction to go into New York, to go for Jewish students to go visit the Rebbe. And they were privileged to have a private audience, a Yechidus of the Rebbe. And at that meeting with the Rebbe, they had lots of questions they posed to the Rebbe. They said, you're an old, great sage. We're young, practical students. One of the questions they had was, they asked philosophy and theology and all types of things. One of them said, listen, we're secular Jews. Are we good? Are we good Jews? We're good human beings. We know that. But could we be considered good Jews if we don't practice everything? We're not as observant as the Hasidic Jews? The Rebbe looked at them with his broad smile, twinkle in his eyes, as he always did. And he said to them, young men, you guys are spending your winter vacation in New York. And there's lots, you could be spending your time right now at a Broadway show or any of the other wonderful attractions that New York City has to offer. And you're coming to meet with me, an old rabbi? I think you're already establishing, that you're in the right path, even if you're not necessarily on the same page as one ought to be. And that's a separate story I told you in the past about the previous Rebbe, when he once met with some yeshiva, with some college students, and he said to them, listen, I don't do all the mitzvahs, and I'm the Lubavitcher Rebbe, right? He said to them, there's 613 commandments in the Torah, 248 positive, 365 negative. It's impossible for any Jew to fulfill all of them, right? Unless you're getting married and getting divorced and dying, and it's impossible. Besides the point, so many of the commandments are relevant in the land of Israel. Some are only relevant to a Kohen, some only to a Levi, some only to an Israelite. And it's impossible, even of those that you can fulfill, to actually do all of them. It's just not possible. But the Rebbe said to them, I do as much as I can, and I try to do a little bit more. You're not the Rebbe, you're not expected to do as much as I'm expected, right? But do what you can, and try harder to do a little bit more. In this instance, said the Rebbe to these college students, in our parsha, we read about the ladder in Yaakov's dream. And if you have to realize, on the ladder of life, it doesn't matter which rung you're at, but what's most important is which direction are you heading. There's a sign in my office upstairs that says, success is not a destination. It's a journey. Very good. Success is a journey, not a destination. And likewise, the ladder of life doesn't matter exactly which rung you're at. Some people are lucky to be born into a great different rung of the ladder. Some people are financially better off than others. Some people are spiritually better off than others. But what's most important, my friends, is which direction on this ladder are you heading? Which direction are you going? On our spiritual journey, are we developing ourselves? Are we refining ourselves? Are we growing every day? That's the question. And this is what the Rebbe said to those students, but that's the basic premise. The idea of the book of Tanya is that on this journey, are we in a healthy spiritual alignment? Do we have the right balance? Are we doing the right things? For somebody to be sitting and studying all day, that's not healthy because they're neglecting and abandoning their physical needs. For a person who's only engaged in their physical well-being, what about their spiritual? So this is something he addresses at great length and in great detail in the Tanya. And he authored this work to substitute his mentorship for the throngs of people who were seeking his guidance. When Ramesh and Fegi had the yechidus at the Rebbe, those must have been one of the last yechidus that was possible to get. Because already in the 70s, it was much harder to get a private audience and meeting with the Rebbe. And as more and more people were seeking the Rebbe's guidance and advice, so he would have more general meetings. Anyways, this is the book of Tanya, and he says it's based on a verse in the Torah that Moshe Rabbeinu says, Ki karav alecha adav ha'meyod, that the Torah is very close and near to every one of us, that we're all capable of studying and fulfilling the Torah's commands. And so we know that to this day, the Tanya's influence has been very significant, right? It continues to grow. What are we, how many years? 225 years or more. How many, if it's 1796, it's 227 years now since the first publication of the Tanya from 1796 to today. And thousands of Jews worldwide study the entire book. And next week, Shabbos, will be the conclusion, the culmination of the annual study cycle of the Tanya. And as it starts again, I encourage all of you, and myself too, to begin and to study the Tanya, and every day to learn its insights, because it's a good way to guide ourselves with that Hasidic inspiration. Many people rely on the Tanya as the driving force behind their personal relationship with God, as is very much addressed and discussed in the Tanya. But as I mentioned the Tanya to you today, I want to remind you and tell you that at the time of the Tanya's initial release in 1796, life was anything but a bed of roses for the author of the Tanya, the Alter Rebbe, and for those who studied his work and applied its teaching in their daily lives. It was not easy. It was very difficult. In fact, the Alter Rebbe and his students, who were called Hasidim, that is what the name of the Hasidic movement is. Hasidic. Hasid literally means pious. It's a name that's you first encounter in the Mishnah. In Tractate Brachas, it talks about the Hasidim Arishanim, the original Hasidim. Long before the Hasidic movement started, there were Jews who were called pious. In Pirkei Avot, Ethics of Our Fathers, what does it say? Who's a Hasid? A person who, does chesed, does kindness, but in Pirkei Avot it says, that's one thing. A mischased im kainet, one who does acts of kindness, yes. Another is one who goes lifnim meshura sadin, one who goes beyond the letter of the law. That's what it says there. In Tractate Brachot, it says one who prays at great length, which is part of why they were called Hasidim, because they used to pray at great length. The irony that today probably the non-Hasidim probably pray longer than the Hasidim do. That's not a good sign. I'm not saying that's right, but that's just an interesting observation. But there was a lot of skepticism of the Hasidic movement then. And that skepticism turned into cynicism. And that cynicism sadly turned into a large scale animosity and controversy and derision and communal division. Any other adjectives you want to add to describe that? Diversity. Halavaya would have been just a accepted diversity. It was a splintered faribble, unfortunately. That's what it was. Yeah. So I'm not gonna. I don't really want to talk so much about that, diversion in the community, because sadly it was a very difficult chapter of our history. There was tremendous persecution against the Hasidim. There were people who did all types of things to hurt the Hasidic movement, and I don't want to focus, especially during these days, on the derision. Okay, that's not what I want to talk about. Okay, we don't want to sow discord or any kind of negativity. Instead, I want to talk about a little bit just the history as it was, and I'll start off today. We'll do two texts, okay? Just two texts. The first text I want to look at is where the opposition started, okay? It started, we're going to look at the following timeline for today. The libelous testimony against the Alter Rebbe that started in May of 1798, okay? Just everyone, bear with me, please. I'll take time to take all questions, but not to interject, please. Again, we'll get to it. I'll answer your questions and I'll take all questions. So please feel free to write it down to remind yourself. I just want to keep my concentration, and also those who are watching us live that don't appreciate the disruptions. Thanks. We'll start. You'll see. I'll answer that question in a minute. Okay. And how it reached the Tsar, because at the time this went to the Tsar, and what happened was the Alter Rebbe was imprisoned by the prosecutor general of Russia, and the testimony said something very shocking, and that was that the Alter Rebbe was gathering a following of a Jewish youth whom he was training to live a lifestyle of crime. You'll see the text of this letter in a second. I will put it on the screen. And they said that he was indoctrinating them in support of a revolution. Now, they took half-truths. What were the half-truths? They were able to accuse the Alter Rebbe of treason. There's all of you here, and I want to thank Miriam for spearheading this. Of all of you who are crocheting and sewing, and what's the right word for this? I'm looking around the room. I can see it all here. For those who are watching us live, here, take a look. You could see all this going on here, the beanies, and what are you guys making? Blankies and beanies and other wonderful things. This is all to help the IDF, to help the soldiers in Israel, right? That's one of the purposes of this mission, and this is something very impressive. Now we know that when October 7th hit, here at Chabad House, we put out a message, a call to send things to Israel, and there was a tremendous response. This is not the first time that Chabad spearheaded a campaign to send goods to Israel. Because in the 1780s, the Alter Rebbe founded a charity called Kolel Chabad. Anyone here familiar with Kolel Chabad? Kolel Chabad is a charity that has been going on in Israel since the 1780s to this day. It's still going. And Kolel Chabad is doing a tremendous amount of good in Israel currently, as it is done back then. And so, my friends, let me tell you a little bit about Kolel Chabad. There were many Jews who were living in Israel. These were, whatever you want to call them, Zionist or religious Zionist. When people like to say Chabad is not Zionistic, I would like to rebuff and pop that myth right here. Chabad did not buy into the secular Zionistic approach, which was that the state of Israel could substitute Judaism. That Chabad did not buy into. That you don't need to be religious anymore, and all you need to be is loyal to the state of Israel, which unfortunately was what many of the founders of Zionism. Theodor Herzl was not a religious man. Many of the others at the time, sadly, and if you look in Israel's national anthem, Lihiyot am chafshi ba'artzeno, to be a free people in our land. Now, I guess the word free is open to interpretation, but according to some, the word free is like free of religion. We are very, very staunch supporters of Israel. Chabad had a presence in Israel long before the state of Israel was reestablished in 1948. And the Alter Rebbe was sending money, financial support to the Jews, to the Hasidim, to anyone, the Chalutzim, the people who were living in Israel. And this was one of the ways they were able to create this libelous claim against them. Why? Who controlled the land of Israel in the 17 and 1800s? The Turks, the Ottoman Empire. They were at odds with Russia at the time. And therefore, supporting the Turkish was seen as treason, as a betrayal against the Russian government. And so, by the Alter Rebbe sending financial support to Jews in Israel, they had proof that he was a traitor against the Russians. Now, the reason why that proof was inaccurate is because it was also the time of the French Revolution, and the Alter Rebbe was supporting the Russians over the French. But this was all part of a process that had to be uncovered, and much investigation and interrogations that brought to that truth. So this was something that they claimed against the Alter Rebbe, and it's very unfortunate, but that was the story at the time. And you think about it. I want to, in fact, put on the screen one of the letters that was sent to the Russian army against the Alter Rebbe. I'm sorry I'm not so fancy in my system here, but you could read it with me. Okay, here's the text. In the text, this is a letter. And the question that Tzippa asked, who would say these things, who would write, we'll get to that after. Let's first read the letter, and then we'll discuss it. In the Belarusian region, in the town of Lyazhna, a rabbi by the name of Zalman ben Baruch has arisen. He is conspiring and gathering young Jews, all of whom are disobedient, and he's preparing lists with the intention of helping the French Revolution, which again is a lie, because the Alter Rebbe helped Russia against the French. Many of the Hasidim enlisted in the Russian army at the time voluntarily. That was a little bit later on where they started the Cantonists, where they were recruiting by force. That was a separate time. Let's continue the letter. While they wait to act, they do nothing except live as outlaws and fill their days by indulging in various delights. They eat and drink opulently, they go around idly, they lead each other astray, they steal and take bribes and disgrace all of the relatives. My own children, says this person, have stolen all of my money at the large sum of 10,000 rubles, and it has made its way to the Zalman ben Baruch in Lyazhna. I have not been able to track down my children and the other evil people because of the bribes they have given to the authorities. They also have advocates in St. Petersburg who protect them and their friends. They deserve nothing else but to be drafted into the army and to be sent to the front, or perhaps to exile them permanently to the wilderness. Boy, quite a harsh letter, yes? Now, here's my question that Tzipora asked him. Who could have written something like that? Who? Was it written by a Russian anti-Semite? Unfortunately, this was written by a Jew. Yep. And this testimony was signed. I Dafka omitted it so I could ask you this question. It was signed by a man named Hirsch ben David from Vilna. Okay? Now, it's possible that this man had anger and hatred and resentment because his son joined the Hasidic movement, that many Jews were drawn to a more joyous, Jewish, optimistic approach. But here you have a fellow Jew who did this, who wrote this horrible letter to the Russian authorities. If Jews in Tsarist Russia felt this and expressed this, you think about that. Right? Think about Fiddler on the Roof. Remind me. You know, somebody said to me, he took his baba to watch the Fiddler on the Roof show, and he asked her, do you remember when it was playing? Did they have it here? I know. I remember when they had it on Broadway. Anyways, he says he asked his baba who grew up in Russia, I mean, I could have asked it to my father who grew up in Russia. He said, tell me, Baba, what did you think of this show? And she said, to be honest, it did bring back memories of the hen. But you know something, Baba, my Baba, he said to him, I really don't remember that much singing in the hen. But what's that line in Fiddler on the Roof? Help me out here. When Tevye says, may God bless and keep the Tsar far, far away from us. Well, in this instance, as you've seen, this principle was violated. And what do we see here? Jews informing on Jews. Jews hurting other Jews. And that's very, very sad what happened here. And, you know, you think about that time where the French Revolution toppled the French monarchy in 1789. When was Marie Antoinette? What year was she? That year. But they were overthrown, right? That was the French Revolution. And she was so out of touch with the people, you can understand why they did so. And Tsarist Russia took all threats pertaining to the revolution very seriously. On a separate note, there's a great story that there was a chassid, I'm forgetting his name, but I think it was Moshe Meislish. Moshe Meislish was a person who was adept, who was skilled in many languages. I mean, I could relate to that. My father was a person who was very multilingual, spoke many languages, grew up in Russia, and then learned French and German and Swiss and Italian and Hebrew and Yiddish and Spanish and Portuguese. My father was very fluent in many of those languages and other languages. He could speak a little bit of Arabic and Korean and Chinese. It's incredible. Some people have that talent. And unfortunately, I don't. Я хочу говорить по-русски, почему сейчас нет говорить хорошо. Me gustaría hablar español, pero no comprende mucho bueno. What else? Y que ni prata Afrikaans ni. That's about it. I could tell you in any other language. But there's some people who could speak multiple languages. Like I said, my father was able to, and this Jew, Moshe Meislish, was able to as well. Moshe Meislish, because he was so fluent in multiple languages, Alter Rebbe dispatched him to help the Russians, and he was a spy for Russia in France. And the story goes that one day he was suspected of being a spy, of espionage. And Napoleon himself said, I'll determine if this man's a spy. Immediately began to take the man's pulse. And he checked and he said, nah, he's not a spy, leave him alone. It was normal. The pulse was fine. Later, they asked him, how did you dodge that bullet? You could have been busted and exterminated. You know, you could have been executed for espionage. That's a very highly treasonous act. You're in the French war room and you were able to get away with it. And he said, from something the Alter Rebbe taught in Tanya. What's that concept? The Aleph of Chassidus. Moyach shalit alalev. Mind over matter. If you don't mind, it doesn't matter. But that idea of the mind controlling the heart, of the intellect overpowering the emotions. Very often, how often does that happen, that we act on our emotion? And Chassidus teaches that we can't just be emotional, we need to be intellectual. They need to be aligned with each other. Which is why when we don tefillin, there's the head and the heart, that they have to be in sync with each other, but the head is superior to the heart. And that's a concept that's taught in Chassidus. But at the time, when the Alter Rebbe was teaching this, and the Alter Rebbe was arrested and imprisoned, where? In St. Petersburg, and he was suspected of being a revolutionary, and a lot of the Hasidim at the time were detained as well. So today we'll conclude. I'm not even going to go into the next text. We don't have time for it. But on Yud Tes Kislev, many refer to it as Yat Kislev, which is next week, that we're going to be celebrating. And that's why we're taking the time not to prepare for that day with understanding the history of it. And I know it went a little bit slower than I expected for some of my stories and jokes. But on Yud Tes Kislev, by the way, speaking of, I have one more story to tell you. Speaking of the French Revolution, you know, the time of the French Revolution, there were a lot of people who were being executed. Like I told you, Moshe Meislish nearly was. And what was their form? What was the French's favorite? The guillotine, eh? They were like guillotines. And one day, there were three men who were being led up to die. One was a lawyer, one was a doctor, and one was an engineer. So they lead the three men, and the lawyer was to die first. And he was led to the guillotine. And what happens? The attending priest blessed him. He knelt with his head and neck down to the guillotine, and they released the blade. But miraculously, it stopped like right just before, halfway down its path, just before his neck. So the priest, seeing this opportunity, quickly said, "Gentlemen, God has spoken and said, this man is to be spared. We cannot kill him." And the executioner agreed. And so the lawyer was set free. Then the doctor was next, right? And he's blessed by the priest, same thing. He knelt, he placed his head down, they dropped the blade, and again, Nachamal, it stopped. Well, very lucky this man. Again, the priest says that God has intervened, and we have to let him go. And the executioner agreed, and the man was set free. And now, at last, it's the engineer's turn. And he's blessed by the priest, same as before. And then he kneels, and the blade is lowered, it's released, and again, it stops halfway. At which point, the engineer looks up and says, "Ah, I see the problem." Ladies and gents, I think this is an appropriate story to end with, because there was a problem in world Jewry at the time, and we see the problem when we don't get along with each other, which is very reflective in this story that happened 220 something years ago. And this is the story we're going to talk about this week of the arrest of the Alter Rebbe, the libelous claims against him, which if you say he was sending money to Israel, supporting the enemy of Russia at the time, which was the Ottoman Empire, and twisting certain truths to try to prove that the Alter Rebbe was leading this revolution and a cult and all that they did. But fortunately, thank God, all their claims turned out to be proven false. And he was liberated on this day in 1798, but on Yutas Kislev. And this is the day that is the Rosh Hashanah of Hasidim. It's a tremendous day on the Chabad calendar, probably the greatest celebration of the year, the Hasidic New Year. It's still celebrated with tremendous fanfare, and it's going to be a big simcha. So we'll talk more about this, please God, in the coming days. Please come back tomorrow for more. And if you have questions, I'm open to hear them. Otherwise, enjoy lunch. Please God, we'll proceed tomorrow. I'm looking forward to seeing you all. Thank you all very much, and see you same time, same place.